folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today, talking about this, the Nikon 40mm F2 Z mount special edition, which is to say vintage-esque styled lens for the Nikon Z mount. I may have said that already. So this lens comes in two versions. This is the SE version, the special edition, which is just made to match up somewhat with the Nikon ZF and ZFC cameras. And it looks the part. It's somewhat evocative of one of Nikon's old F-mount lenses, at least pre-DSLR days, back in the sort of AIS era. And here, it's pretty minimal. You've got nothing on here, absolutely nothing. You've got a manual focus ring, which I guess is fine. It's somewhat unsatisfying. This particular one actually have an aftermarket hood from, I want to say JJC or JCC. You know, it's one of the plentiful brands of aftermarket stuff coming out of, you know, eBay and Amazon and AliExpress. And yeah, it looks nice. I like it. It just threads on. I'm not going to take it off right now because it doesn't really matter, and it's going to make a terrible sound. Aluminum on aluminum, at least. Yeah. So for an element of the lens, as you might expect from being a fairly slow lens, all things considered, is quite minimal. It's pretty tiny, especially considered to, you know, what seems kind of like, by comparison, a wide lens. That, you know, is just a fact of life because of the Z mount. It's chonky, so the whole lens has to be really big, even if the front aperture here is, you know, just a couple, I think that's barely even 20 millimeters across, to be honest. But it is, you know, not a terrible lens, all said and done. I wish the build quality was a little better, actually. It is plastic mount here. We've got, you know, any kind of sealing rings, nothing. The body's really plasticky. At least the filter ring, I believe, is metal. I think that inner barrel there is metal. Sounds like metal. So all in all, you know what? It's not an expensive lens. It is an aesthetic lens. That's kind of what it's here for. So how does it do? How does it perform? Well, we're going to find out because 40mm isn't actually that bad for some Milky Way type astrophotography. F2 is a little bit slow, especially at 40mm, so I don't think you're going to be doing too much work untracked, but tracked, it could be interesting. Get, you know, a nice tight normal view of what the Milky Way would be. So again, I'm just kind of delaying us. Let's get into Lightroom and take a look. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we have 4 samples taken with the Nikon ZF, and these are the 40mm f2 Z mount lens. Yes, I'm Canadian, we say Z. This is a relatively inexpensive lens, not overly fast, but it's also not overly slow. And I have it, and I have a Nikon ZF. So this is what you're getting, basically. Hopefully this is of interest to somebody. But let's see if this lens is worth using for astrophotography. Why not? A couple things to note. Of course, the ZF is around 24 megapixels, so not a bad resolution for astrophotography. Of course, not my usual preference to go is high resolution as possible so that we can really put this lens through the ringer. But, you know, this is pretty usable. It's going to be something that a lot of people might be using for astro. 60-second tracked exposures. We've gone through 4 f-stops here and tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Of course, Fervent Astronomy is Fornax Mounts exclusive distributor in North America. So if you were curious about the LighTrack, you can head over to ferventastronomy.com and take a look. Now, as is my custom, whenever I have a camera that has some linearity to its ISO profile, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you know, sit tight. But in the case of the ZF, it really has 2 general amp stages at 800 and around 100. What am I talking about? So ISO invariance, if you haven't heard the term, refers to when a camera the relationship between the ISO levels and the noise are linear at certain points or throughout certain ranges. What that means is essentially is that the camera is not doing analog amplification, it's doing digital amplification. So in the case of the Nikon ZF, an easy way to think about it is there is one analog amplification stage at ISO 100 and another at ISO 800. And as you go from 100 to around 640 or whatnot, it's relatively linear, noise increasing with the ISO, and then it drops again. And it doesn't drop all the way down to base, but it drops a fair amount, and then it picks up at ISO 800 and then starts to march on again in a linear fashion. What that means is anything after ISO 800 for the most part is essentially like the camera doing a little exposure bump here in Lightroom. It's using digital amplification, which is amplifying not only the signal, but the noise. When you go from ISO 800 down to ISO 100, that's a analog amplification stage to an analog amplification stage. And what you'll see is you'll get, for, in no uncertain terms, less noise at 100 than you would here at 800. That being said, astrophotography ISO 100 is not too useful. So for a camera like this where there's kind of a zigzag relationship and some linear portions with the ISO values, I like to use the second or the last reasonable analog amplification stage. All right, I explained that probably less good than usual. You can head over to the description, follow the link back to ferventastronomy.com. I've got some links there that can bring you to explainers for ISO invariance, and you can learn about it to your heart's content. But basically, for our purposes, know that whether we're shooting at ISO 800 or 8000, we're not actually getting any more real exposure or less noise at 8000 than 800. So I like to shoot here at that second base ISO if I can, and this will give me the same file basically as if I had shot higher, with one little difference. Stars, if they blow out, the highlights blow out, if it clips on the right side of the histogram, or galaxy cores, or let's say like bright nebula, the cores of bright nebula, what you can do is if you shoot too high for too long to try and get a good exposure of the whole thing, you might risk blowing the highlights out and being left with no information in those bright spots. Well, what do? Well, in this case, we actually shoot at this base ISO. That allows us to preserve some of those highlights, maybe preserve them completely, and then we can boost the exposure up to whatever we would have reached at ISO 8000, and we'll be left with the same noise profile and everything, just maybe a little bit more information left in the highlights. And this is, I should say, if you stay at the same aperture and the same exposure time. So as long as the only thing changing was that ISO value, that's what I'm talking about here. So you know what, sit back, relax. If you had if you have a few minutes, follow the link back. Not only will the link give you access to these files in their full raw glory that you can download and pixel peep and help assess either the lens or the camera in this case, but you'll also get those links that can help explain maybe a little bit more clearly what I just talked about. That being said, I always encourage people to download the files. Please do so. Use them for your own personal reference when making a buying decision about this lens or the camera, but please respect I am the copyright holder, and I did put in the legwork to get the samples in the first place. So don't disseminate them online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as samples for your own content, etc. But use them in good faith for the purpose that they're being provided. Thank you so much. So like I said, 60 seconds. So let's pop in here. We've got Ursa Major here, pretty close to zenith on the night that I took these. So that's why we're seeing it as just kind of a cute thing to frame up. Overall, with this lens wide open at f2, we are seeing that we've got some vignetting happening, which is not unusual, especially wide open. This lens is pretty small, so the smaller the front element in a lens, the more we tend to see vignetting wide open. The only real way to combat this is if you have quite a large front element to help even out the light that's coming in there, but this should clear up with some corrections. If we zoom in here to the center, we see a couple of things. Actually, we've got some fringing here, so we've got a little bit of that chromatic aberration and possibly a bit of bloating there, but that is sort of par for the course. Here we have generally round stars. We don't have any aberrations really in the middle of the frame here. Sometimes this fringing can be corrected in post, sometimes not, but at the moment we won't worry too much about it. Let's go take a look here halfway to the corner, and here we can see that the star shapes are starting to get a little bit weird, so we're starting to see some aberrations. Now, these bee or space bees, I guess, looking things, these are aberrations, and you might be thinking to yourself, oh, this lens has coma. Well, actually, I don't think this lens really does have much coma, maybe a teeny little bit, because this isn't coma, this is astigmatism. Now, what's the difference? Well, astigmatism comes in two general flavors, tangential and sagittal astigmatism. So tangential astigmatism, in this case, would be responsible for the body of the little space bees, and sagittal would be responsible for the wings. And what's happening is the light is having difficulty being focused by the lens in a single point. So the tangential astigmatism will occur across radii that extend between the edges and center of the frame, and so they'll always generally point towards the center of the frame. Sagittal is at a right angle to that, so it's going to circle the frame more or less. It's not to say that it's always going to be along a perfect curved line, but tangential would be pointing from the edge to the center, and sagittal will kind of cross that T. Sometimes it might be a bit of a curve one way or the other. Sometimes it might be quite extreme, but it's never on the same axis. So sagittal, tangential. And that's really what's happening here. As we stop down, one or the other might be better resolved. But yeah, now speaking of coma, we'll go back here. So chromatic aberration actually is a type of aberration where a star, a pinpoint of light, will start to kind of spread out into a bit of a wedge shape, and you'll get one end that's fuzzy. And if you look here, and we're going to just zoom in real extreme. So here we've got this one edge of the star that's a little bit fuzzy. So this might be coma. That being said, it's not really that bad. The star isn't turning into like a big, pizza, wedge of pizza or something like that with a big fuzzy tail, and viewed from normal viewing distance, you can't really tell. So in that case, I wouldn't worry too much about it. This might be a little bit of coma, but it's the least of our concerns. Really, the major aberrations that we're experiencing here are these astigmatism, and especially the sagittal astigmatism. Like, look where we are. We're not too far out of the center of the frame. So this will happen a little bit more prominently on brighter stars, and a little less so on dim stars. Here you can see more in the extreme corner, we're having it happen on some of the dimmer stars, and you can see we've got sagittal and tangential astigmatism, and they're all kind of adopting that same sort of look. And here the sagittal is sort of riding really on the center end of the tangential astigmatism as far as its relation to the center of the frame. Let's go in the other corner here. We've got it here. What is nice is it's a consistent shape. Same thing here. So far we've got some good symmetry. Yeah, and exactly the same here. So that's actually not bad to have the same shape. We can have 4 different types of shapes actually if the lens is made a certain way or has those characteristics, and that can tend towards some messiness. So it looks like at the very least this particular lens is fairly symmetrical. If you look here, they are pretty apparent, and yeah, by the time we're not quite halfway away from the center there, sort of not a huge deal for these stars. We're going to notice it more here, unfortunately, because we've got some brighter stars, but the dimmer stars aren't going to show that quite as much. And then as we get towards the edge here, we get those same sort of aberrations. You know what? It's a very inexpensive plasticky lens. I'm not really surprised, and it's certainly not meant for this, but it's fun to take a look anyway. So we can come in here and we'll look at the center as we go from F2 to F2.2, 2.5, 2.8, and then if we go into the corner here, 2.8, 2.5, you can see the sagittal astigmatism is mostly resolved at 2.8. At 2.5, there it is, and it just kind of gets a little bit bigger as you go 2.2 and then F2. So I guess you could shoot this lens at f2.8. Look here at some of the brighter stars that were giving us some trouble. So I'd say we're probably better off doing this at 2.8. It's resolving some of that fringing as well, which comes back as we open up. So f2.8 and f2, all things considered, not terribly different from one another. And you know, this lens I think is actually fairly okay. Like, I know, you know, this looks kind of bad, but it's fairly average to maybe even above average as far as things of this nature. So yeah, f2.8 tracked, I'd do it. But we'll go back here and we'll take a real quick look at some stuff in the develop module. Now, I didn't detect too much field curvature, and field curvature would occur when the lens is focusing different parts of the frame at different distances. So you might be in focus dead center, but as you go towards the edges, you might lose focus. Sometimes it can be even, you know, more wild than that. You could be in focus in the center, but then have a sort of ring around that where it loses focus, and then it gains focus again as it goes towards the edges. It really depends on the construction and the optical formula of the lens. In this case, it's looking for at least a 24 megapixel sensor for our purposes with astrophotography to be more or less fine, not a lot of field curvature. It's not an overly fast optic, so that's not very surprising. We'll enable profile corrections here, or chromatic aberration correction at least, and it's not really making a big difference. We can go in here and try and correct some of this manually, and it looks like actually that didn't do a bad job. You do have to watch in some cases if you do that. I'll just crank it up. And oh, actually it's not too bad in this lens either. What can happen here when you do that, let's see if I can artificially, nope, okay. Well, what can happen is that you can create these big blocks around the stars. Maybe there's something starting here a little bit where you'll get these odd colors. They're usually some type of greeny brown, and they'll put these big squares basically around every star. That's how Lightroom deals with this fringing, and it sort of counteracts it. But in this case, you know what? I think you're pretty safe to just do a normal defringe. I don't see, at least in this particular part of the sky, that it's too much of an issue. So that's nice to see that it's malleable to that. All right, next thing we can do is apply a profile correction. And when we do that, we see that we're relieving some of the vignetting, although not actually that much. I really would have expected it to be a bit better, but what can you do? You can always manually tweak it to try and fix things. Might have to go into the manual setting here. There we go. And there, that's looking a little more even, but you can also try all kinds of things. You can do a mask gradient and all that type of stuff. One thing we will notice as we flip this profile correction on and off is that there's a tiny bit of a transformation happening in the corners, but not really in the middle of the frame. So there's not really too much distortion here. Distortion is different from field curvature. Distortion, you can imagine if this was a brick wall, we had straight lines across in real life. We take a picture, if we had pin cushion distortion, our straight lines would kind of curve down a little bit. And if we had barrel distortion, our straight lines would sort of curve up a little bit. And we can fix this in post here using profile corrections and the transform window. In this case, there's not much to correct here. It looks like there's a very slight barrel distortion overall, because it looks like the corners are kind of coming towards us a little bit. They're being stretched towards to make them in the same plane as kind of the center. And they're losing just a tiny bit of their field of view here. Like you're losing a smidge of your diagonal field of view, but you're not really losing much. If you watch stars along the edges, you can see that they're not, for the most part, getting cropped out. So the lens is holding up pretty good from a distortion standpoint. I mean, I wouldn't worry about that normally, but it's definitely worth flipping the switch there basically to do that. So not bad. And you know what? The defringing worked a treat. For the most part, it's got rid of that blue-purple. So that, I think, is making this lens even a little bit more usable. So all that being said, I hope you found this interesting. Again, the samples will be available for you to take a look at if you really want to see things in full detail and full resolution. And overall, yeah, if you have this lens and you're willing to do some tracked astrophotography, it might not be the worst option out there if you wanted this type of, fairly wide focal length to maybe capture constellations or something to that effect. But I hope you found this useful. All right, well, you know what? I didn't buy this lens for astrophotography. In a pinch, I mean, tracked astrophotography at this focal length, it's going to be something that I'm going to probably lean more towards a faster 50mm lens because I do have access to them. Would I use this? As with anything in a pinch, of course. Am I going to make this my number one ride or die? Probably not. But that's not why I bought it. I bought it because I have a Nikon ZF and it matches. So I'm vain. What are you going to do about it? Anyway, I hope you have found this review, if not illuminating, at least somewhat informative. Is this a lens that you're going to do astrophotography with? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? You could let me know in the comments below. I don't like doing the YouTube. I don't like doing the YouTuber stuff. Maybe I'll get more comfortable with it. Never say never, but is this the lens for you? Are you going to take it out at night? Are you going to get a Nikon ZF or a ZFC or just any Nikon camera and just go around and do some street photography? You know what? That's, I think, where this lens really shines in its compact nature. It's fairly minimal bump out of the camera. That's how I'm going to use it primarily, but I'm not against taking it out on the sky. At any rate, I hope you found this review informative, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Take care.